All right, let's keep going with Module 6 of our Catalyst Missions Pastor Training. This is our homiletics portion. We're talking about preaching. And we ended last time, and I just want to put a button on that. We ended last time talking about exegetical application, and we introduced this idea of the theological bridge. Meaning we're looking for, what does the passage teach me about God? What does it teach me about man? And these things really never change regardless of culture, context, time, or space. And that's what I use to apply it to my modern audience. So we asked some questions that would help us determine what does the passage teach us about God and man. We said, what does the modern audience share with the setting of the original writer? So what do these two situations have in common? 2, can we identify with biblical men and women as they heard God's word and responded or failed to respond? And we use the example of the original 12 disciples, and really Jesus' call hasn't changed for us today, and our response has to be the same as theirs was if we want to follow Jesus. And if we don't, if we respond like the 6,000 did in John 6 that walked away from Jesus, the response from him will be the same. So there's a theological bridge. We said, what does the rest of the Bible teach us about some of the responses to God that we see, like for instance in the Old Testament. For instance in Hebrews, we have the author telling us that we should not harden our hearts as they did at the waters of Meribah. That's a reference to the Old Testament. So this New Testament passage says you better not respond like they did. So when we're applying that to our modern context, we want to say, don't respond. Look what Hebrews tells you. Don't respond the way that they did to God. And then, what specific practical applications does this idea have for me and my congregation? What specific attitudes, feelings, or actions should this idea that I'm presenting to them evoke? What suggestions might I offer to my audience? So we're trying to figure out, did the author present his idea mostly through application? And how do I effectively apply this text to my audience? Because I can do a lot of damage to a passage, for instance in the Old Testament, if I apply it in the wrong way. If I think that every text in the Old Testament is directly linked to my congregation, and I don't realize that I have to understand their context, and that the way God operates might be a little bit different now because I'm not the ethnic people of Israel, I'm the church of God. There's a lot of relationship because all the promises of God are yes in Jesus. We're in Jesus, we receive God's promises, but at the same time, we're not ethnic Israel. So we have to understand their context, what's the same, what is different, what does this text reveal to me about God? What does it reveal to me about man's response? And that is what I take over into the modern context and apply. So, overview of analyzing the exegetical idea. Let me read this passage and then we're going to move on to lesson 4. Note that the questions build on each other. We're at the bottom of page 18. Only when we think we understand a statement do we question its validity. And only when we understand and believe a statement will it make a positive difference in our lives. While you may deal with all 3 questions in the development of your sermon, one of the 3 predominates and determines the form your message will take. All of this preaching leads you towards your homiletical idea, which occupies you in the next stage of development. Here's his point. Even though in your sermon you might have all 3 elements, you might have some explanation, some validation, or some application, the author presented their idea predominantly or mainly in one of these 3 ways. And I need to find out not only the big idea of the passage, but how did the author present the big idea? And that's the way I want to present it to my modern audience. And all of this helps me move from having this big exegetical idea that I've taken from the passage, and then crafting that idea in a way that my modern audience will understand. So this takes us into lesson 4. I'm going to erase this for us. And in lesson 4, we're talking mainly about sermon form. Lesson 4, you can see there on page 19, we're talking mainly about sermon development. And I'm going to skip that summary portion at the top because in the other videos we've done, we've taken a lot of time to review. So in lesson 4, we're talking about this idea of sermon development. And really, I want us to focus on three main ways you can develop a sermon. And there's three basic options for formats. One of them is deductive. One of them is deductive. One of them is inductive. And one of them is semi-inductive. Now, I want you to know, this is not the most important part of preaching, by any stretch of the imagination. You could choose these different formats for virtually any passage in the Bible. Now, passages in the Bible really often work better with one or another of the formats. For instance, an epistle normally works better with a deductive format. A story normally works better with an inductive format, for instance. But you could use a deductive format for a story and inductive for an epistle. You could change them. The most important thing is everything we've talked about up till now. Because everything we've talked about up till now deals with rightly interpreting the text. And I want to remind you, 2 Timothy 2:15 says, "Show yourself to be a workman approved unto God. Be diligent to present yourself approved unto God, a workman who does not need to be ashamed, but who rightly divides the word of truth." That word rightly divides means cut straight. The Bible, as we see in Hebrews chapter 4, is a sword. And it cuts. And we have to be people who know how to use the Bible correctly and apply it well. That's the whole idea of 2 Timothy 2:15. Be a person who knows how to use the Bible well. And we're talking now about sermon formats, and it's important, but it's not nearly as important as everything we've talked about in understanding hermeneutics the right way, interpreting the Bible the right way, knowing how to apply it the right way. So, if you're at a point and you think if you're teaching this module to others, and you think that this might be difficult for them to understand, something that we've covered thus far up till now, they just are not understanding, pause and take time and study through another passage, give them another example, make sure everything we've talked about from the beginning of Module 6 until right now, in the first three lessons, makes sense to everybody. And if it doesn't, pause, go, and work with them on that. So, all right, here's the three sermon formats, though. Deductive means, basically, it's just the way you would think about any deductive argument. It's that you start with the main point at the beginning. You start with the main point at the beginning. This is sort of like Paul does in Romans chapter 9, when he says Romans 9:6. It's right at the beginning of this kind of new section in Romans, and he says it is not as though the word of God has failed. And then everything beyond that is proving that point. That's a deductive argument or a deductive sermon. And so that's the way a deductive sermon works. You make the point at the beginning. It might be something like this. Today, I want to present to you the reality that Jesus is the resurrected Messiah, and that he has all reign and authority over our lives. And then you're going to talk about everything after that. That's deductive. Inductive, if you see there at the top of page 19, uses the introduction as a lead to the first point, and every point after that is moving towards the revelation of the idea at the end. So deductive gives you the idea from the beginning. Inductive gives you the idea at the end. Deductive is an explicit statement of the idea. Here's what the idea is. Inductive oftentimes gives the truth implicitly. Like if you're telling a story, often the truth is not explicitly stated, it's implicit within the story. And that's how an inductive sermon often works. Here's an example of that. I could say that my wife is a nice person. And then I could tell you why she's a nice person. That's deductive, okay? Here's the point, here's why. Inductive would be something like this. My wife went to the store for her grandmother, and bought her groceries and took them home to her, and then she sat down with her and she made her dinner and just ministered to her the whole day. And what you would conclude implicitly is, my wife is a nice person. Now the truths are the same, they're presented in different ways. That's deductive and inductive. Semi-inductive means that you mix the two, okay? You start a sermon, for instance, inductively. You might start with an introduction. You don't state the main point. It's an introduction. You might give a quote, or you might give a statistic, or you might give a story, and it starts off and it leads you to your first point, and then in the middle of the sermon you give the main point, and then you finish the sermon deductively. So it might be something like you give a story in the introduction to start the sermon, and it leads you to this first point, and then you reveal the main point of the sermon in the middle, and the rest of the sermon is proving or explaining or applying that main point. So it starts inductive, finishes deductive. That's why it's called semi-inductive preaching. Now I want to focus here mainly in this section on deductive. I want to focus mainly on this deductive arrangement, and I want to give you can actually do a deductive sermon format in 3 different ways. One of them is by explaining, one of them is by validating, another is by applying. Now, remember, we just talked about however the author presented their main idea is the way I want to present the idea in the sermon. So for instance, if I'm preaching Romans 9 and I know Paul presented that idea by validating it, and I want to do a deductive sermon, I would do a deductive validation sermon format. Okay? If I know that the author presented it by explanation and I want to do a deductive sermon, it'd be deductive, but by explaining. Same thing with applying. So this is why it's really important not only to understand the big idea, but how the author presented their idea. So let's start off with deductive explanation. Look there at the bottom of page 19. Based on your development of the exegetical idea, sometimes the idea needs to be explained. This arrangement becomes particularly important when wanting to convey biblical doctrine. The hope is that your explanation will kind of spur application. So in other words, as you're explaining something, so if you got a passage like, let's say 1 Corinthians 9, where you have, 1 Corinthians 12, where you have Paul explaining the idea of Christian unity by using the image of a body. Hopefully, as you're explaining that, okay, as you're explaining that to your audience, this is going to immediately kind of spur or provoke application. Like the audience is going to think, oh, well, I know exactly. If the church, if Christ's body is a body, that means maybe I'm not functioning like I need to as a body. Maybe I need to help members who are hurting, or maybe I need to think more about other people. You see, if you explain it, hopefully it's going to spur application immediately. For a sermon like this, the arrangement is pretty clear. You'll have the introduction where you state the idea, okay? So 1 Corinthians chapter 12. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the unity of Christ's body, and we see this because Paul gives us the image of a body, and that's how we all relate to one another. Okay, that's the main idea. That's the main idea. Then in the body, okay, so that's the main idea. In the body, you state all the complements. Okay, so in other words, how did Paul explain that? How did Paul explain Christian unity is like a body? You just go to 1 Corinthians 12 and you see, okay, well, how did he explain that point? And there's different ways that he explained that point, and that's what you would give in the body of your sermon. And in the conclusion, you repeat the idea. Okay, so you have introduction, state the idea. The body deals with all the complements the passage gives that explain that idea, and then in the conclusion, you repeat it. Look at here's an example that was used in the main text where we take our notes here. It was by Alexander McLaren's sermon from Colossians 1:15 to 18. And if you like, we can read that passage really quickly and use this as an example. Colossians 1:15 to 18 says this: He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is also the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he himself will come to have first place in everything. Now, McLaren said that the main point here is, well, you can even see there. I put his introduction and then his subjects and complements. Look what he says. Why is Jesus Christ supreme over all creatures in everything? So that's the main point. Why is Jesus Christ is supreme over everything? He says that's the main point. That's the big idea of Colossians 1:15-18. Jesus Christ is supreme over everything. So then he put it in the form of a question. Why is Jesus Christ supreme over everything? Because he believes Paul is explaining that point. And he says he explains it in three ways. One, what he says right there, because of Christ's relationship to God, because of his relationship to creation, and because of his relationship to the church. So Alexander McLaren, in doing this sermon, said the main point is Jesus Christ is supreme over everything. He said Paul is explaining that idea in three ways. Because of his relationship to God, he is supreme over everything. Because of his relationship to creation, he is supreme over everything. And because of his relationship to the church, he is supreme over everything. Now, let's see how he developed this. In his introduction, McLaren said, Christ fills the space between God and man. There is no need for a crowd of shadowy beings to link heaven and earth. Jesus Christ lays his hand upon both. He is the head and fountain of life to his church. Therefore, he is first in all things to be listened to, loved, and worshipped by men. Now, you can see in his that's his actual introduction to this sermon. You can see the three complements that he explains right there in the introduction. Look what he says. Christ fills the space between God and man. He's supreme because of his relationship to God. He says we don't need anybody else to link heaven and earth. There's his supremacy over creation. Then he says he lays his hand on both, and he is the head and the fountain of the church. There's the third way that Paul explains Christ's supremacy. Relationship to God, relationship to creation, relationship to the church. And Alexander McLaren brings them all out in the introduction, and then at the end of his introduction, look what he says. Therefore, he is first in all things to be listened to, loved, and worshipped by men. That's our response to him. If Christ is supreme because of his relationship to God, creation, and the church, then we ought to respond by listening, loving, and worshiping him. That's a deductive explanation. He starts off with the point, he gives the compliments, and he ends with a response. And actually, he brings that all out in the introduction. That's exactly how we need to think about a deductive explanatory sermon. McLaren purposes to motivate Christians to response through this explanation. In other words, he doesn't even, when he's explaining these ideas, the response is almost inherent. Obviously, you're going to respond by loving and listening and worshiping Jesus. So look at the quote there from Robinson. As Robinson noted, in this entire sermon, McLaren does little else but answer the question, what does this passage mean? What does this passage mean? In the deductive explanatory assignment, the introduction played a major role not only in stating the idea and its complements, but also creating a need for the explanation. So in the introduction, he states the idea, all of the complements, as well as how we should respond. That's a deductive explanatory sermon. Okay? Deductive validation. What about deductive where you're validating it? Sometimes the biblical author presents their idea through validation. We've seen that, so we know if you want to do a deductive sermon on a text where the author has presented their big idea through proving it, then we need to use a deductive, a format that is deductive and is validation. Now look here at the bottom of page 20. In this arrangement, the preacher uses the introduction to state the idea as a proposition needing defense. For instance, here's an example. Go to the bottom of page 20. If you're preaching on Romans 6, and you want to defend the proposition that Paul does that Christians cannot live in sin because they're dead to sin. If you've read Romans 6, you know that's Paul's proposition. If we are dead to sin, how can we go on living in it? That's Paul's argument, right? So if we're preaching that passage from the beginning, we're stating that proposition. We're stating that idea, and we're saying that needs to be proven. So that's how we would present it. In this arrangement, so again, look at the example. Christians cannot live in sin because they're dead to sin. That's how you might even state it. In this arrangement, the points or the complements of the sermon are arguments defending that idea. So everything that comes after stating that idea in the introduction is defending that idea or proving that idea. And and again, this is based on how the biblical author presents it. But in Paul's argument in Romans 6, he makes that idea and then proves it, particularly in Romans 6:4. Therefore, we have been buried with Christ through baptism unto death, and like as Christ we were raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we should also walk in newness of life. So he says, why can't you go on sinning? Because you're dead to sin. Well, how do I know? Because I've been baptized with Christ. There's his first argument, okay? And he goes on presenting other arguments, and that's how we should present it to our audience. You'll notice that this reasoning type of sermon alters the wording and arrangement of the sermon outline. Look what, in Romans 6, Paul uses if-then conditional clauses quite a bit. Again, why don't we just go to Romans 6 real quick, take a look at it. Romans chapter 6, look what it says. He says, the main point here is, a Christian cannot continue to sin because they're dead to sin. Look at verse 2. How shall we who died to sin still live in it? Okay, then he starts talking about baptism. He says, we have been buried with him through baptism unto death, that like as Christ was raised up from the dead, we walk in newness of life. There's number one. Number two, if we have become united with him in the likeness of his death, certainly we shall also be in the likeness of his resurrection. So he says, so if you've died with him, you're not only walking in newness of life here, you're going to be raised with him as well. So new here, new forever, in a new body, right? And look at verse 6. Knowing this, that our old self was crucified with him in order that the body of sin might be done away with, so we would no longer be slaves to sin, for he who has died is free from sin. So there's your response. You are free from sin. There's your third argument right there. There's your third argument. So here's the stated proposition. Christians can't continue to sin because they're dead to sin. How does Paul prove that point? You're baptized with Christ so that you would walk in newness of life here. If you've been, that's point one. Point two, if you have been baptized with Christ in his death, you will be raised in a resurrection like his. Point two, you're not just new here, you'll be new there. And then here's the third point, which is kind of an argument plus a response. He says, you have been set free from sin. So that's how we should present it to our audience. If we're preaching this, the deductive validation, this is how it would go. State that main point in the introduction, and then take the rest of the sermon to prove with these three arguments that Paul gives us in Romans 6, 1-7. Those three arguments there become the points of your sermon that prove that main idea. And then you conclude with the response. If you're free from sin, how should you live? Obviously not as a slave to sin, because you are not a slave to sin. That's why it says, before we go to deductive application, the notes say further, the conclusion is not merely a restatement of the idea and complements, but it is like a summation of the case and the recourse needed. Meaning, you're almost like a lawyer at the end of the sermon. You're bringing it to a close, and you're saying this is the response that is needed now. Deductive application, and we'll end with this. For this session, the deductive arrangement may also answer the question, so what? So if you're, again, the passage, the author may be answering the question, so what? They're presenting their big idea, mainly through application. So in this form, if the author's doing that, I want to present it mainly in that way to my audience. In this form, the preacher uses the introduction to establish the biblical idea and the remaining complements provide the implication of this idea. Okay, so just like we've done with explanation and validation, I state the idea in the beginning, and the rest of the sermon is applying that point. So I'm giving the different points of application for that idea that the biblical author presents. One of these, an example of this would be 1 Peter 1:16. Okay, so 1 Peter 1:16 is the famous sort of rehash of the book of Leviticus. Be holy as I am holy. Okay, well then he tells you how to be holy as he is holy. He talks about being prepared. He talks about not being conformed. He talks about conducting your lives in a way. So if you look at 1 Peter 1:16, the main idea is be holy as I am holy. But he's not explaining that, and he's not validating that. He's applying it. He's telling you how to go about being holy as he is holy. And in the power of Christ, we prepare ourselves. In the power of Christ, we do not conform to this world. In the power of Christ, we have a conduct that looks like the Christian life. Again, that's how Peter applies this main point in 1 Peter 1:16 and following, and that's the way we should present it to our audience as well. Again, if you just want to look at 1 Peter 1 really quick, just want to make sure we're getting this as clearly as possible. 1 Peter 1. Look what he says beforehand and then finishes with this point. Verse 13. Therefore, prepare your minds for action. Keep sober in spirit. Fix your hope completely on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Prepare. As obedient children, watch this, do not be conformed to the former lusts which were yours in ignorance. But like the Holy One who called you, be holy yourselves in all your behavior or conduct, because it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. So, point, you shall be holy, for I am holy. We ought to be holy as God is holy. Well, how does Peter apply that? How does he how does he apply that directly to our lives? He says three main areas. Prepare yourself, prepare your minds for action, don't be conformed to the former lusts, and be holy in all of your behavior. So Peter doesn't explain it or validate it, he's applying that. He's telling you how to do it. And that's the way we ought to present it to our audience. In this form, the sermon develops with manifold ways to act, think, believe in accordance with the biblical idea. The sermon is doing what the biblical text is doing, which is telling you, based on this idea, how should I act and think and believe in order that this becomes a reality? If he wants me to be holy, how should I act and think and believe and conduct myself in order that that becomes a reality? And Peter tells you that, and that's how we should present it. The conclusion serves as a call to embrace that and to respond accordingly to the application of the idea. So, that is deductive. Now, in the next session, we're going to talk about inductive and semi-inductive arrangements of sermon formats.